Starting a new quarter, so we'll have new books. I guess we need a daily Bible reader count first. If you are a daily Bible reader, if you want to raise your hand, Mike will get you counted. And Barry is poised with books, so if you need a book for this quarter, we give out some Wednesday night, but if you need a book, he's got plenty. I said he had plenty. While he's going back and getting more books, Brother Derek, would you mind leading us a word of prayer as we get started? Thank you, Derek. Well, as Barry goes and gets some more books, just get his attention if you need one when he comes back. We're studying the books of poetry this quarter, and I thought I'd read a little bit from the introduction that is in our companion guide because it kind of, I think, gives a good intro into the study for this quarter, and it's kind of interesting. It mentioned that not all poetry rhymes, Jackie. I don't know if you knew that. But evidently there's some poetry that doesn't rhyme. Now the poetry that I'm used to reading, Room on the Broom and Dr. Seuss and all that usually rhymes. That's what I'm kind of used to over the last few years. But most of the poetry in the Bible doesn't rhyme, but just read a little bit here. It says, poetry in the Hebrew language does not rely on rhyme as poetry in the English language usually does. Instead, the device that maintains a formal structure is called parallelism. You English teachers are probably more familiar with that than I am, but a form typically of two lines in which the second line says substantially the same idea expressed in the first line, but in different words. This form is called synonymous parallelism. Another form, called antithetical parallelism, occurs when the second line presents a negative form of the first line or a contrast. So we're going to read in a little bit our lesson text, but if you look, for example, in Job chapter 5 and verse 25, where our text is going to be, it says, you shall also know that your descendants shall be many. That's the first line. And then the second line, and your offspring like the grass of the earth. So essentially, the second line is saying the same thing that the first line is. Your descendants are going to be many, going to be like the grass of the earth. Obviously, the grass of the earth, there's a lot of it, so there's many. So that's kind of the form that the author's talking about. And as we go through the different lessons in this quarter, we're going to see, I think, examples of both. We're going to see examples where you've got two lines, and the second line kind of reinforces the first line, and you're going to see some of that antithetical parallelism they talk about, where the second line doesn't necessarily, or actually goes opposite of what the first line says. But in a lot of these poems that we're going to look at, they can be hard to grasp in a way because they use a lot of figures of speech, they use metaphors, and it's not like some of the other writings that we're used to. He that believeth shall be saved. He that believeth is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not will be condemned. It's pretty easy to understand. Now some people miss it, but that's pretty plain. It's plain language. Some of the language we're going to look at in this quarter is not going to be quite that plain. And a lot of it is general principles that are usually true, but maybe not true in every case. And that's something we're going to look at this morning in Job. In general, the words that we're going to study are true. The problem was the author of those words, the author of this speech, tries to make an application that didn't need to be made in that case, and we'll look at that. But the author in your lesson book points out that poetry is the language of emotion. And certainly the book of Job, where we're going to be studying this morning, is an emotional book. And we're going to be studying a speech from one of his friends. We usually remember those friends that came to comfort Job as being really bad comforters. Okay, they made a bad situation a lot worse. But something I never really thought of until I started reading this lesson is that we have insight that those friends didn't have. Those friends came, and all they knew when they came and they heard about what had happened to Job and all these terrible misfortunes that he had gone through, that's all they knew. They didn't know what happened in the first two chapters. And just kind of as a way to remind ourselves, in the first couple of chapters, we're introduced to Job. And he's described as a man who was blameless and upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. He was a very successful man. I like how, in the Old Testament, how they describe wealth. Okay, they didn't describe wealth in net worth or cash in the bank like we do. They describe wealth in livestock. And I appreciate that, okay? And he had a lot of livestock. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys. That's a lot of animals. And I'm sure he had a lot of land to put all of those animals. And if a good economist wanted to, they could probably figure up what all those animals were worth. And beyond that great wealth that he had, the Lord had also blessed him with 10 children and a large household. He had lots of servants and things. But he was a good man. And it always, I find it interesting that when God and Satan are having this conversation, for lack of a better term, of all the people in the world that he could have pointed to, God said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Yeah, and it makes you think, if God and Satan were to have a conversation today, who would he point to? I can't say that he would say, "Consider my servant Chris." But it's a thought-provoking thing, and it makes you realize really how good of a person Job must have been, that God pointed him out to Satan as an example of someone who was blameless and upright. And of course, Satan's response was, "Well, of course he serves you. You built a hedge around him. You've taken care of him. You've given him all these things. But if you take those things away, he'll curse you to your face." And so you know the story that God allows Satan to take those possessions and take those children. And Job holds fast to his integrity, and he doesn't curse God. And even when God allowed Satan to touch his body and physically have those boils from the sole of his feet to the top of his head, Job still refused to curse God. And that's the thing that we are aware of that his friends aren't aware of when they come to try to comfort him. In the end of chapter 2, it says, the very last verse, "So they sat down," this is Job's three friends, "they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw his grief was very great." We've probably all been in situations where we were around someone and they'd lost a loved one, or they had a sickness that wasn't going to get any better, and you struggle to find the right words to say. And for 7 days and 7 nights, no one said anything. And I just think about how uncomfortable that had to be. But it was probably a lot better when they said nothing, because when they started talking, they actually managed to make the situation worse. But after those 7 days and 7 nights, then Job starts talking. And we're not going to look at a lot of chapter 3, but I do want to mention one verse that I think kind of summarizes what that chapter is. In verse 3, Job says, "May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which I said, a male child is conceived." We think of Job as being patient, and he was. We think of him and dealing with the adversity that he had, and certainly he did, but he had questions. He questioned why this was happening to him. He had a lot of issues with why this was going, because Job didn't know what happened in chapter 1 and chapter 2 either. And so I think that's worth pointing out. But then we're introduced to the first of the three friends, and this is the man that we're going to look at this morning, Eliphaz. And Eliphaz in chapter 4 starts talking. He answers Job after Job gives this speech about why have these things happened to me, and I wish I'd never been born, and all of that. Eliphaz starts speaking in chapter 4. And in verse 7 says, "Remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed." Eliphaz, it seems, thought that Job must have done something to deserve what had happened to him. He had this idea that it must be some secret sin going on here in Job's life for God to have been willing to take all these things from him, to take his livestock and his wealth and his sons and his daughters, and to physically hurt him with this affliction. Must have been because there was some sin. And as we read our actual text, which we're going to get to, beginning in chapter 5 and verse 17, the author mentions that Eliphaz could have been right about some things and wrong about others. And I don't know that I'd ever thought about that. I always just thought the three friends, they were bad guys, and they gave him bad information, and shame on them for not knowing better. But in general terms, the things that we're going to read, the words from Eliphaz, in general, as far as general principles go, they're correct. And in general, what he's saying is sin is going to be punished. Righteousness is going to be rewarded. The problem is, and where he made his mistake, is he thought that was going to apply in every specific situation in life, and that he thought that Job must have done something wrong. And in his mind, I think he put himself in a situation where he was trying to guess and be in the mind of God, that he knew why God was doing this. He forgot the words, or didn't know the words, I guess, of Isaiah. My ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Sometimes we try to guess why God does what he does, and that's what this man makes that mistake in chapter 5. Let's go ahead and read our text, and beginning in verse 17 of Job chapter 5. This is his friend Eliphaz saying, "Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore do not despise the chastening of the Almighty, for he bruises, but he binds up. He wounds, but his hands make whole. He shall deliver you in 6 troubles, yet in 7 no evil shall touch you. In famine he shall redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. You shall be hidden from the scourge of the tongue, and you shall not be afraid of destruction when it comes. You shall laugh at destruction and famine, and you shall not be afraid of the beast of the earth. For you shall have a covenant with the stones of the field, and the beast of the field shall be at peace with you. You shall know that your tent is in peace. You shall visit your dwelling and find nothing amiss. You shall also know that your descendants shall be many, and your offspring like the grass of the earth. You shall come to the grave at a full age, as a sheaf of grain ripens in its season. Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear it, and know for yourself." Job's friend begins with really a 2-part answer. He says, first of all, God, or Job, God is making you a better person by making you go through this. He's saying that, beginning in verse 17, "Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore do not despise the chastening of the Almighty." That's the first thing he tells him. The second thing he tells him is that it's going to be temporary, that this isn't going to be something that's permanent. Job, "For he bruises, but he binds up. He wounds, but his hands make whole." Now, you could argue, and I would agree, that this was really bad timing. That it wasn't the best time for him to come to Job and say, if God brings you to it, he'll bring you through it. It's going to get better. It's only going to be temporary, Job. Even though that was true, and we're going to look at a passage in the New Testament that's has some similar thoughts as this. This probably wasn't the best time to be mentioned in this, and his idea that again, that Job must have sinned and done something wrong to do this was incorrect. But in principle, what he was saying was correct. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 5. The Hebrews writer says, "And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them. But he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So in my mind, at least, a similar thought there in Hebrews as to what Eliphaz gives Job in Job chapter 5. That being that sometimes God disciplines us and it's for our own good. Now again, a misapplication of it, that's not what God was doing to Job, but the principle was true, that sometimes God does discipline his children. Just like as parents, we discipline our children, and we say it hurts us more than it hurts them, which isn't always true, but it's what we say anyway. But we do it for their own good. We don't like to discipline our children, most of us, I think, but we know that if we don't, they're going to be the kind of kids who run out into traffic, or worse than that wind up in all kinds of trouble when they get older. So we discipline our children because it's what's best for us. And sometimes God disciplines us because it is what's best for us. So again, the principle is correct, but the application isn't. And I wanted to read another section in the commentary here that I thought kind of summed up where Eliphaz made his mistake. The author says, "Like the friends of Job, Christians sometimes feel compelled to say something to still the pain of a father or mother who may have lost a child, or a husband or wife who has been betrayed by a mate. It is simply wrong to tell them that God is making better people of them by sending evil. Further, little comfort comes from the assertion that the pain is temporary. Job's friends would have done better, and we will do better, to listen to the one who endures pain. A shared tear, a touch, and a listening ear are often better than answers we feel compelled to offer." And so sometimes, I think that's true, in those moments where we're beside somebody in a hospital bed, or we are at the funeral home trying to comfort someone, just being there, I think, is comfort enough. And we always feel compelled to say something, but sometimes the more we try to say, at least in my perspective, sometimes the worse we make it. And I think that's where one of the places where Job's friends messed up is they tried to act like they knew why God was doing this, that they knew all the answers, that they somehow knew the mind of God in such a way that this must be what's going on, when the reality was, it wasn't. But again, the principle that God sometimes does discipline us, or that just even if it's not an issue where he's disciplining his children, just going through adversity can make us better. That there can be value of affliction. That's the title of our lesson. And there's plenty of scriptures that we can look at that bear that out, that there is value in affliction. And I want to look at a few of those. Beginning in the book of Psalms, we're going to look at some other psalms later in the quarter, but Psalm 119, there's a couple of verses that I think bear that out. In verse 67, the psalmist said, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. So the affliction actually helped the psalmist be more faithful. And again, in verse 71, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn your statutes." But again, while we're going through the affliction, that's easy to say when things are good, that there's value in affliction. But when we're actually going through it, again, the Hebrews writer was correct that that suffering doesn't seem profitable at the time. It doesn't seem good at the time, and no doubt it didn't seem fair to Job. It didn't seem just that he would be going through this, because he knew, that it wasn't a sin, some evil deed that he had done that was causing him to go through this. Comments? I don't want to miss anybody if you have a comment.
People say the same type of things today that Eliphaz, but when they weren't really helping Job at the time, Job was suffering.
Sure.
He needed comfort. He didn't need to be raised over the coals by what they were saying. And it was a long time. Even though they said true things, it wasn't the place and time for it. I'm just going to use myself as an example. There's been times in my life after various surgeries and things where I just struggled to get through the day, and I was in pain and stuff. And people would, come by, or family members would say, "Well, just think, there's millions of people in the world that are worse shape than you are." That doesn't help me. That don't make the one that's suffering.
That's right.
feel bad.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so people today do the same thing.
Sure.
And Job's friends were doing. Not the time and place for that.
Yeah, and so I think timing is one of those things that we can learn from his mistake. That when we talk about speaking the truth in love, and some of the things that we can speak, they may be true, but are we speaking them out of love? And are we speaking them at the appropriate time or the right time? I think that's what you're getting at, Don. Now, in general, again, sin brings punishment. And that's in a general principle. And a lot of this poetry that we're going to look at this quarter, again, is general principles. And in general, sin brings punishment. You can look at the Old Testament and New Testament both, and there's plenty of examples where somebody sinned and they were punished. Moses hit the rock. He got angry and hit the rock. He was punished. Uzzah, I think it was, that reached out and grabbed the ark, immediately punished. But that doesn't mean every calamity, every bad thing that we go through in life is because we're being punished for some sin. And that's the misinterpretation that Job's friends had. I'll leave you with this, and this was a point that the author made. What is clear in Job is that individual guilt or individual godliness does not always result in corresponding misery or joy in this world. Just because we go through life and we try to be good and righteous and do what God wants doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to go our way. In fact, there's plenty of examples and plenty of passages where Jesus warned his disciples and Paul warned Timothy and others that the opposite was probably going to be true, that we were going to suffer persecutions. And yet sometimes when we're trying to convert someone to the gospel, or we have a new convert, we maybe give them the notion that everything's going to be gravy. And on the other hand, just because somebody goes through life and does a bunch of bad things doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily suffer in this world, but in the world to come, all those rights, all those wrongs are going to be corrected. Jackie? Appreciate y'all being here. Have a good rest of the day.